start by introducing our host, Mr. Sajid Jeffrey, Head of Energy and Commodities at Mashreq Bank. Sajid, we're here to discuss today the question of how the world can navigate a post-fossil fuel energy order. That's enough of a question, but also amid geopolitical increasing uncertainty and economic fragmentation. Of course, we see evidence of that every day. So a big question for us to tackle today and get everyone's views on within the next half an hour. But I want to just start by welcoming you and giving you a minute or two to open up the discussion for us.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you, participants, distinguished guests, for being on this webinar today. As Dale has said, this is a very broad question and one of the most complex ones in our times, where we have been seeing the focus on energy transition, yet the energy security and other priorities, the geopolitics, are not letting the investments or the transition be, going at the same pace as expected. The fossil fuel is still contributing the bulk of energy demands, and the clean fuels are still, let's say, limited, but picking up gradually. So we would, of course, want to share hear your thoughts, see and explore with you guys what is your views, how and when do you think this balance will be achieved given these geopolitics, the camps between different geographies, the supply chain challenges and others. So thank you, and I'll leave the floor open for you guys.
Thanks very much, Sajid. Dr. Adi Imsirovic, author of The International Oil Markets at the Age of Energy Transition. Dr. Adi, thanks for joining us. Let me start with you and just ask you a sort of overarching question of, yes, we've got, increasing geopolitical challenges, of course, in our way, and a lot of economic transition as well, these tariffs and trade being the headline story these days. But even if you put those aside, and particularly recent developments on that front, has the energy transition, in your opinion, sort of taken a back seat to energy security in the last 2-3 years? Given the Russia-Ukraine situation and Europe's, for example, reliance on Russian gas, we have seen a slight, I suppose, reluctance of investment, haven't we, compared to the sort of run that we saw into the early 2020s?
Well, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, by the way. Well, going back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think it was one of the key events that happened. It really highlighted the energy security as the key issue short term. Now, of course, moving on to sort of indigenous forms of energy, such as solar or wind, is providing hell of a lot of energy security. Unfortunately, it's very time dependent. It takes a while to do, just as it is in terms of fossil fuels. So losing a massive amount of gas, or bulk of the gas that was coming into Europe, the first priority was essentially to replace it. Now, having said that short-term commitment and short-term problem, it doesn't really mean that sort of we are going back to fossil fuels as a solution for our long-term strategy in providing energy security in any way. And I think numbers speak for themselves. I think electrification in most parts of the world is really overtaking investments in fossil fuels. So, very recent report by IEA said that, look, even before that, we know the electricity is growing, demand is growing 3 to 4% per year. Oil, which is close to my heart, is growing just over 0.5%. So that tells you the whole story there. So fossil fuels such as oil, obviously gas is a slightly different story, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later on. But oil is definitely taking sort of a backstage gradually, very, very gradually. Let's not forget, even though I'm fairly bearish oil overall, I still would not forecast the end of the oil industry anytime soon for many, many decades. I think that demand will continue, and I think oil markets will continue to be very important and healthy. But overall, they're taking back seats, more kind of strategic sectors, moving out of being the fuel that's must have pretty much for all the applications to having some specialized applications away from gasoline, diesel, towards more petrochemicals and sort of more niche sectors.
Okay, I mean, and as you said, there's definitely a shift. Of course, fossil fuels are still essential, but the global demand profile is shifting as we sort of advance and accelerate electrification into the sort of power mobility sectors, as you said. So how is that, Adi, just sticking with you today, immediately, or how has it so far sort of impacted any shift in sort of refining and value chain sort of integration? I mean, obviously we've seen, as you said, the petchem focus is becoming ever more evident as well. But in terms of the electrification aspect, impact on refining and investment into refining and those value chains, we're still at the start of that, or do you see that accelerating again?
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, in Europe, we see it very obviously. I mean, we saw it first. I think the first obvious signs of sort of slowdown in refining was Australia. Europe's now becoming another Australia. Essentially, we're seeing Grangemouth here and a number of other refineries potentially shutting down. They're not shutting down for no reason. Basically, demand is increasing, but it's actually at the margin is slowing down, or whatever you call it, the second derivative is negative. So that demand is just not sufficient to sustain the simple refineries like the ones we have in Europe, old ones that require a lot of investment. On the other hand, in the Middle East, quite for good reasons, you've got this vertical integration where the producers are going for value-added chains, going more into sort of complex refineries and petchem structures that come with those refineries, so they can add value and reduce volatility of their revenues in refining. Whereas in developed world, it's slowing down. So, refining is definitely turning into a bit of a dying industry unless you have complex structures with petchems associated with that you can actually have some sort of control over your revenues.
Thanks, Adi. Professor James McCallum, Executive Chairman and Co-founder of Exergy Group. James, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. I mean, as Adi was saying, obviously fossil fuels remain absolutely critical, particularly for developing economies, and particularly those that are growing very fast, for example, in Asia and Southern Asia, and industrialization there. But so that, it's a yin and a yang, isn't it? We still need them. And of course, oil and gas companies play a huge part in supplying those fossil fuels. Now, is the oil and gas industry, in your opinion, doing enough to decarbonize what it is supplying? Admittedly, they are going to be needed for decades to come. But how far along have we come in that commitment and investment?
So that's a great question, Diala. To which the answer is a very easy, clearly not enough. But if you wind back from that answer, the oil and gas producers, in particular the independents, blow with the wind in terms of popularity. And there is no doubt that at Offshore Energy Week in Aberdeen a couple of weeks ago, there's a wide acceptance that the fact that the major producers find themselves in the penalty box or being the bad guys, if you like, is something which they bear a huge amount of responsibility for themselves. So if they're going to win back the argument, then they have to at least be looking after their own shop to the best of their abilities possible. Now, it has to be recognised that in the last 5 to 6 years, you go back 4 or 5 years ago, and one of the arguments that was being put forward by the large oil and gas companies was, we are part of the solution. We may historically have been a part of the problem, but you have to see us as part of the solution. We are big energy producers. We can clearly pivot and change and be a part of the whole renewable energy revolution. And then 3-4 years in, they're winding right the way back out again. So just at the stage where, and to be honest, I'm a bit skeptical about this, where you might have thought that they were beginning to win back a bit of trust. They were beginning to win back a little bit of the argument with the financial sector in terms of producing finance for ongoing developments. They suddenly jump right back out of the space again and say, yeah, actually, do you know what? It's not for us. And then on top of that, you layer the pivot of the world off the back of energy security issues, as Adi has adequately explained. And that brings with it huge implications from the point of cost of energy to the consumer, not just the industrial consumer, but the ordinary consumer. You know, that builds in inflationary pressures. It builds in major political issues for governments, and you see governments swinging back. And so now all of a sudden you almost have the oil and gas companies going, oh, well, there you go. Problem's gone away.
Absolutely. And I mean, you said as it's not for us. That's kind of quite significant, because there is the argument that's been made by both oil and gas companies and other sort of, I suppose, tech or industrial companies that know, you know, things like wind and solar should not be being done by oil and gas companies. Leave the oil and gas to those and let some other new, players. And I'm assuming that the financing, therefore, also may be more or less attractive towards those projects because of that. If banks like Mashreq see that, oh, actually company X is investing in offshore wind, it's not BP, then maybe that's more attractive. I mean, and on that point, James, just offshore wind, I know you track that quite a lot as well as an industry where you're based, obviously also in Europe. That's also taken a bit of a bash, hasn't it, in the last few years? I mean, where's the future of that? Solar is bouncing ahead, but the wind, offshore wind and power has a bit of a challenge from a financing point of view.
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, you know, the cost of access to energy is ultimately the principal argument that's being played out here. Now, for a while there, but rightly or wrongly, you know, sort of like how one addresses the carbon issue, you know, was layering in over the top of that and pivoting the banking sector towards who they lent money to and who they didn't lend money to.
Yeah.
When all is said and done here, the people who should always be delivering the result are the people who can do it best. That doesn't matter whether you're in the oil and gas industry or, you know, or producing ice cream. The reality is that markets find their own dynamic, and whoever produces best, you know, ends up being the company of choice. Now, ultimately, I think what you touched on an area in the middle of that, Diala, which I just want to draw attention to, which is the issue around productivity. You know, the reality is productivity and the most efficient productivity is another massive prevailing argument in what we're actually seeing in the diversification of who does what in the energy sector. And when one is pursuing best practice, what we're increasingly beginning to see is that layered into that delivery comes the digital transformation space, which has been kind of in the background for about 10, 15 years. You know, at ADIPEC, I remember 10, 15 years ago, there was a sort of like the theme was all about data engineers or whatever, and then that went away again. And now that's coming back in the guise of the different forms of AI. But applying that digital transformation to the energy delivery story is in and of itself going to consume enormous amounts of energy.
Absolutely.
So we've got this really interesting circle going around, which is to get better, we need to consume more energy. If we consume more energy, it's going to cost more. If it costs more, you know, we better pivot back to conventional supplies and sources. And that's what's caused the pullback from wind. Wind is expensive. Solar's got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Wind ultimately absolutely has to be a part of the energy diversification play, but as does nuclear, and nuclear is making a huge comeback right now.
Absolutely. And I said the cost of AI generation and I mean, the demands on the power sector that we're already seeing on that, and the projections are absolutely enormous. Dr. Stephen Griffiths, welcome, Professor and Vice Chancellor for Research at the American University of Sharjah. Thanks for joining us. I mean, talking about technologies, what about those, Dr. Griffiths, that need to be applied to sort of hard to abate sectors, you know, to remove carbon, CCUS, etc., hydrogen? I mean, this very ambitious technologies, and again, coming back to cost, you know, there's been a big argument about, well, this is very costly and we need to have, guaranteed off takers, etc., particularly in this region, the Gulf, where I'm based and where you're based, Dr. Griffiths. What is the role of those technologies today? Have they taken a back seat due to cost, or do we see there's still a light at the end of the tunnel for that investment?
Well, I'll start off by saying I'm optimistic. And in addition to that, thank you to Mashreq for the invitation to participate today. So the way I see it, and I'll just reflect back on what Adi was saying to begin with in the original context of the discussion. Three areas I see always being addressed when we talk about energy. One is of affordability, one is decarbonization and climate concern, the other one is security. Right now, we're in this state where the affordability and the security is outweighing the climate issues, and there's a geopolitical dimension to that, and many different factors. And so, what that's led to is a different way in which I've been thinking about the transition as far as its speed. At 2015, the Paris Agreement, everyone thought we're going to go very quickly to renewables. Everything was going to happen quickly with industrial decarbonization in transport and the power sector and buildings. But now we're looking at maybe a longer time for that to happen. And so, coming to your question about what's the role of the technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture, the framework in which I've been trying to make an even stronger case than I always had made is this notion of the circular carbon economy. People know about circular economy, but when it comes to where I think the future is going is we have a longer period in which fossil fuels are going to play a role, just given the dynamics we were talking about. The reduction of fossil fuels is important. So renewables, and James talked about nuclear, we talked about wind, and then of course there is the energy efficiency side. But when you get to the three other R's of the circular carbon economy, removal is becoming more and more an essential paradigm. Because the longer we have assets that are in place that are generating CO2 emissions, the more likely it is we're going to have to capture CO2 from point sources and remove CO2 from technologies like direct air capture, direct ocean capture, and the like. So those things are going to be very important. Economically, they're not completely viable today, as we know that. They're not viable because you require a lot of policy to make them viable. I think they're going to be very important. The removal parts, as we talk about, how we can look at something beyond simply storage and geological sequestration and such. Enhanced oil recovery, I think, gives a sense of the reuse of CO2 when you're not doing some kind of transformation, which will still give some longevity to the oil and gas sector while having an environmental value to some extent. So we don't want to forget that enhanced oil recovery and use of CO2 in ways in which you don't transform it's important. The most interesting to me, though, the area that I'm most engaged in the research is looking at the recycle of CO2. When I say recycle of CO2, it's where hydrogen comes into play, and you can transform CO2 into something different that is useful. So it's almost undeniable once we go around this circle of affordability and climate concern and energy security, we come back to the concern for climate, even when you're having a higher cost for the technologies. Bringing a clean hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen together with CO2, which is hopefully a low emissions or low carbon footprint CO2 when you have the full capture chain involved, bringing those two together for maritime decarbonization and aviation fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, is definitely essential and required. So doing a lot of work in that. The challenges today, they're just expensive, right? So we know that methanol is important, electro fuels is important, those kind of things. They're just expensive. And so there will need to be policies in place to catalyze the deployment of these technologies for carbon capture and the creation of the derivatives, which can be very useful for captured CO2 with hydrogen. We can go into a long discussion on some of the work around hydrogen and what it takes to make that a more cost-effective source. IEA just released their most recent global hydrogen summary for 2025. And we're way behind on what's required to get hydrogen to a state where it makes a difference. So there are a number of things we have to do to bring the costs down, and we can talk about those. But the importance to me is there, and it will, if not sooner rather than later, we're going to have to bring these technologies to bear to get to net zero at any point, 2050 or way beyond. It's whatever may be the point.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it is a cost issue. It's economics at the end of the day. Technologies are there, they're being developed, but it's the commitment, isn't it? And the investment on that front. I mean, Adi, just back to sort of the overarching question of, we've got the tech, maybe we've got the solutions, but it's the geopolitics and, this economic fragmentation of which we're seeing firsthand today in the tariff game that the US is playing, and of course other countries are responding to, and we are on a trajectory of more insulatory kind of economic policy, aren't we? Every country is now going to be, even if it is for globalization, going to have to look after itself, onshoring, etc. That is a trend I think that's probably irreversible. And you've got this huge divergence between governments that are being run by the likes of Donald Trump, who is essentially going in a completely opposite direction to maybe what Europe, for example, has been doing with the energy transition. Does it matter if countries are not? Paris is a long time ago, and I don't think we'd ever reach an agreement like that again 10 years down the road. But can we still progress on an individual front, country by country, or does the world need to find some middle ground?
It's a great question, Diala. Normally, these kind of issues of climate change are analyzed within a framework of game theory. And within that framework, what you find is that it's extremely hard to get everyone on board. Now, the one way around it, sort of the old-fashioned prisoner's dilemma, is some kind of leadership. And we don't have that leadership at the moment, that we've lost it. United States had IRA, it was all full swing, we're going one way. Suddenly we've lost it. You said it irreversible, I'm not so sure. It's probably basically being slowed down, the whole situation. But anyway, going back to the coalition, I think we do have Europe and China pretty much. If they could reach some sort of agreement, they could establish a new type of leadership in this respect for renewables. Problem with China at the moment is that, again, our whole subject today was security. And China, whatever they're doing for electrification, for renewables, they're not doing it for climate, they're doing it for security reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and as a result, we have this massive investment in coal power generation, which I think last year was close to 100 gigawatts of new capacity commitment, which is huge. We've got still India with I think about 14, 15 as well last year. Which is very, very large. Fortunately, these are new technologies for coal, so they're far, far cleaner than absolutely cleaner coal, but it's not clean. So this security issue is a big deal. Now, having said all of this, there are a number of points I'd like to make. I think this whole point of, I totally agree with Stephen, but going back to the idea of security, affordability versus climate, I think climate is going to hit us back again. We've just had a study by Imperial College and another college, another university in London, basically University of London study that found that in Europe this year, due to climate and climate-caused heat waves, we've had over 16,000 deaths this summer alone. That's huge. I mean, I was shocked, quite frankly. That's huge. This is just in Europe. In places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, Africa, I mean, these are big problems that we'll have to get to grips with again. And I think it'll come back. It'll come back sooner than we want. Floods and
absolutely. I mean, there's all the evidence, sorry to interrupt you, but all the evidence is there, of course, of extreme temperatures in Europe in particular, which is not used to the sort of 40 plus like other regions. I mean, and James was mentioning earlier that AI and the draw there on the power sector, in a way, it's AI actually, everyone is saying, will be the technology that's going to solve our climate problems if only we would apply it. But again, we're back to how much energy that requires. I mean, James, I'll just go back to you on that. I wanted to talk about sort of the power sector investment. I mean, it's growing every year. I have a statistic here which says it was global power sector investment was 1.5 trillion dollars last year in 2024, but it's still not enough for sort of battery and grid infrastructure in particular. And why would you identify there is a block there? Is it policy? Do we need clearer policies by governments for private sector to invest? Or is it just a matter of that it will just take some more time? We're playing catch up, aren't we, with those grids, especially smart grids, etc. Yeah,
we're playing enormous catch up with regards to smart grids. We're playing enormous catch up with regards to grids that are capable of handling the power demands that are there, let alone whether they're smart or not, Diala. The reality is that I think Stephen is, hit it on the head, where and Adi's quite rightly challenging it. At the present moment in time, affordability of energy is winning out in the argument over energy transition or whatever. It wasn't 5 years ago. It is now, and so the reality is will the pendulum swing back? Yeah, I suspect it will, but will it swing back quite as far? Almost certainly not. We've got, how many times do we have to hear, in every major economy of the world, the word growth and the challenges on growth and how are we going to get growth? Because if we don't get growth, we're never going to counter this inflationary pressure that's out there. So, you turn the clock back to the Paris Accord, and the argument that would have historically come from the major energy producers, the fossil fuel producers, was, it's entirely impossible to throw the big lever and suddenly switch over to renewables. And clearly that was correct, but it's coming from somebody that was untrusted, and so the pendulum swung far too far the other way. And we suddenly found in the major economies of the world that we were paying far, far too much for the electricity that we consume in a domestic environment. And communities reacted to that. Look, I think, we will. I mean, Stephen's right when he sort of says we will continue to progress the technologies. There's no doubt about that. But whether their rollout will be as fast as the world requires for fixed dates in the sand of 2030 or 2035 remains to be seen. If Adi gets, and I hope he doesn't get, it has to be said, some major sort of environmental catastrophe that swings the pendulum back, then we'll see another shift that way. But I think the report which you've produced, I have to say, on the back of today's session, where it shows you the swing of the fossil fuel area between 40 and 60% of overall global consumption, I think is bang on right. And I'm in the space that says it's probably going to be nearer to the 60% than the 40 over the course of the coming years.
Okay, I mean, and Dr. Stephen, I mean, what should we be then? Should the world be adjusting its net zero, roadmaps? Should countries be doing that? Obviously, you have some. It's always been criticized that they're far too long into the future. We need to bring these forward. Where we sit in the Gulf, you and I, there are, being obviously an oil and gas producing region, there's very ambitious also transition plans, clean energy investment, etc. Is it time to officially make? I know there have been some adjustments, but as we get more real about the transition, do you see that needs to be done officially? And I mean, talking about the Gulf, where do you see their position as well going forward? Now that many argue that peak oil is within 10 years' time.
Well, I don't know if peak oil is within 10 years' time. Let's be honest. The numbers for 2030 are now moving to 2035. Yeah. Net zero 2050. The ambitions is going to be very challenging, but it doesn't mean we've lost all hope. I would say for the oil producers and those that are going to be actively involved in the transition, I mentioned previously, to get some of these technologies, we have to get to be cost effective, to get them to where they need to be. We can go and take steps in policy that does not disrupt the current industries, but moves technology ahead. I'll give you an example because I do a lot of research there. Hydrogen, the RED 3, so renewable energy directives in the EU, they're looking at industry having to put 42% of their hydrogen through a clean hydrogen, so low carbon, renewables based, or it could be blue hydrogen, what have you. Where that's going to have the most impact, though, no matter what the source of hydrogen is within the refining industry. So today, if I'm a refiner, I am one of the biggest off takers. I believe I am the biggest off taker, and collectively as an industry, of hydrogen. So when you say 42% of what I'm consuming needs to be from a low carbon source, I'm going to have to pay for that or pay the penalty. So it gets us to the next stage of an evolution where today's problem becomes part of tomorrow's solution. So I'd say 2050 as it was envisioned is probably going to be difficult, but we can still take steps that are positive toward getting toward the climate solution that we all want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. It used to look very far away, but we're getting ever closer. We have run out of time, but Adi, I just wanted to go back to you to wrap up, just because you're also based in Europe, along with James as well. There's a quick question to you. It's another political question in the sort of geopolitics, but Europe's budgets for the transition, and it's obviously Europe was always way ahead in terms of its Fit for 55, etc., all these plans. But of course, the whole defense question has come up, hasn't it? And the whole sort of outlay of money it has to spend on that now going forward immediately. Do you feel that is that being discussed as a problem in terms of interrupting transition expenditure from a sort of obviously government point of view, not private sector? You're on mute, Adi. Sorry.
It's not discussed directly, but implicitly it's there. And it's not just Europe, it's the United States as well, with massive budget deficit and elsewhere. The problem is that, you have to make certain commitments. Going back to this transition, I've always claimed that energy transition is not something that we can make a forecast because it's a function of policy. So you have to see the policy in place that will result in that energy transition. We're not seeing it at the moment. I agree with everyone here that we are behind schedule because the policies are not right in place. And right now we've got a problem of inflation, budget deficit, and Europe particularly has a problem of massive increases in the need for budget for defense. Where's the money going to come from? Something's going to give. So you're absolutely right. I don't know what the solution is, but I mean, there are a number of policies that Europe and everyone else can actually put in place to actually improve the transition without costing very much. For example, over here in Europe, or let's say the UK, where I am, over here, gas is heavily subsidized, whereas we have a lot of tax on electricity. So people are often wondering why we don't have heat pumps in the UK. Well, because they're expensive, because electricity costs about 3 times per kilowatt hour as a kilowatt hour of gas. Very, very simple. And governments really need to rectify those problems. Once they do that, we can have some results.
Yeah, it comes back, circles right back around to policy. But that economic sort of divergence and fragmentation that is just building isn't going to help matters. Thanks so much to Adi and to Stephen and to James for joining us today on the webinar. I'm going to take it back to Sajid just to close off the session for us. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Deolat, and thank you, Adi, Stephen, and James. A very interesting discussion, pretty much in line with what we are witnessing in the world today. The volatility in this policy making is not making anybody's life easier, especially for financial institutions which need that kind of visibility to be able to take capital decisions. And from a banking perspective, what we are really looking forward to is that the multilaterals, the IMFs, the World Banks, to decide and make this focus towards the transition and make it easier, especially for the global South, to be able to adapt to this towards this journey. Thank you, everyone, and pleasure hearing all of you.